The mansion sat perched in the exclusive hills of Atherton, California, a monument to minimalist architecture and profound loneliness. Its vast glass walls looked out onto a garden so perfectly manicured it seemed devoid of life, a sterile green carpet under a perpetually grey sky. Inside, the silence was a physical presence, broken only by the sharp, intermittent cries of a baby. The sound echoed through the cavernous, white-walled corridors, a stark and painful reminder of the emotional emptiness that no amount of wealth could fill. Every surface was immaculate, every piece of furniture a work of art, but the home felt less like a sanctuary and more like a pristine, soundproof tomb. It was a place built to impress the world, yet it offered no comfort to the two souls lost within its walls, a grieving father and his inconsolable son. Ethan Pierce returned home just as the sun began its descent, casting long, cold shadows across the marble floors. At 38, he was the ruthless CEO of a tech empire, a man who commanded boardrooms with an icy resolve. He wore an expensive suit that did little to hide the bone-deep exhaustion etched into his features. His eyes, once alight with ambition, were now hollowed out by a grief so immense it had consumed him. The sound of his son's desperate wailing met him at the door, a sound that had become the soundtrack to his failure. It wasn't just a cry, it was an accusation, a constant echo of the wife he had lost in childbirth. Brushing past the flustered nanny without a word, he stormed up the floating staircase, his frustration mounting with every step. A man powerful everywhere but here. He threw open the nursery door, his anger ready to erupt, but the scene before him stopped him cold. There, in the rocking chair meant for his late wife, sat Elena Reyes, the new housekeeper. She was still in her simple work uniform, a stark contrast to the room's opulent decor. In her arms, she held his son, Noah, and was breastfeeding him. The baby, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, was utterly still. His tiny body was relaxed, his desperate cries replaced by a serene silence as he nursed peacefully. But Ethan didn't see compassion. He saw a grotesque violation. His mind instantly poisoned by another staff member's whispers about Elena being strange and intrusive. To him, this was an unforgivable trespass into his private grief, an assault on his wife's memory. The rage that had been simmering within him for months finally boiled over. It was a blind, irrational fury born from pain. "What do you think you're doing?" he snarled, his voice cutting through the quiet room like a shard of glass. Elena looked up, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and gentle concern, but he gave her no chance to speak. "You're fired. Get out of my house. Now." He pointed a trembling finger toward the door, his face a mask of disgust. He saw her not as a woman who had quieted his suffering child, but as a disturbed stranger who had defiled something sacred. He watched, cold and unmoving, as she gently placed the sleeping baby in his crib and walked out, her dignity a silent rebuke to his cruelty. It's in moments like these, when pain makes monsters of good men, that we are reminded of how fragile we all are. And if you feel that too, subscribing helps us continue to share these important stories. The mansion fell back into its suffocating silence the moment Elena left, but the quiet was different now. It was heavier, haunted by the echo of Ethan's cruel words and the ghost of a peace that had lasted only a few minutes. Noah's cries returned with a vengeance, more piercing and desperate than before, as if his tiny body was protesting the sudden, cruel removal of the only comfort it had ever known. The other nanny, Sharon, who had so eagerly planted the seeds of suspicion, now moved with a smug air of validation, but her incompetence was glaringly obvious. She tried every textbook method to soothe the infant, rocking, shushing, offering bottles of expensive formula that Noah rejected with violent sobs, but his distress only intensified. Ethan, meanwhile, locked himself in his sterile home office, the sound of his son's suffering, a relentless siege on his frayed nerves. Days bled into a miserable week, and the nature of the silence in the house shifted again. Noah's frantic wails weakened, fading into a lethargic listlessness that was far more terrifying. He stopped eating almost entirely, his skin taking on a pale, almost translucent quality, his eyes dull and unfocused. Dr. Evans, the family pediatrician and a man who had known Ethan's late wife since she was a girl, was summoned for an emergency visit. His kind, professional demeanor evaporated as he examined the frail infant, his brow furrowed with a deep, unmistakable concern. He looked at Ethan not as a powerful CEO, but as a man failing his most fundamental duty. "He's losing weight at an alarming rate, Ethan," the doctor stated, his voice stripped of all pleasantries. "He's exhibiting classic signs of infant depression and severe malnutrition. That brief period of stability you mentioned, whatever happened then, it was keeping him alive." The doctor's words, infant depression, malnutrition, were clinical, but they landed on Ethan with the force of a physical blow. They painted a horrifying picture of his son simply giving up, fading away in a house full of everything except what he actually needed. The image of Eleanor in the nursery flashed in his mind, unbidden and sharp. He had seen her as a grotesque intruder, a disturbed woman violating his private sanctuary. But what if she hadn't been an invader? What if she had been an answer? The thought was a small, sharp splinter of doubt lodging itself under the armor of his anger. He had been so certain of his righteous fury, so convinced of the trespass. Now, faced with the cold, undeniable reality of his son's declining health, the first cracks began to appear in the walls he had built around his grief. That evening, as Ethan sat staring blankly at a framed photograph of his smiling wife, Margaret approached him. The house manager had been a quiet, steady presence in the Pierce family for over 2 decades, a woman of immense wisdom and profound discretion. "Mr. Pierce," she began, her voice soft but firm, cutting through his stupor, "there is something you need to know about Elena Reyes, something she tried to explain before you sent her away." Margaret then recounted the story Elena had shared with her in confidence. She wasn't some strange, intrusive woman. She was a mother trapped in her own silent, unimaginable grief. Just 2 months before starting her job at the mansion, Elena had given birth to a baby boy who had lived for only a few precious, heartbreaking days. The truth crashed down on Ethan, knocking the air from his lungs and shattering his perception of the event. He saw Elena's face again, not through the distorted lens of his own pain and suspicion, but with a new, horrifying clarity. He saw the deep, bottomless sorrow in her eyes, the quiet dignity in her posture as she absorbed his insults and walked out of his home without a word of protest. He had taken her private, sacred tragedy and twisted it into something ugly and perverse, using it as a target for his own misplaced rage. His grief had not only blinded him, it had made him cruel. He had projected his own feelings of violation onto a woman who was simply answering the most primal call of a mother's heart, a call she could no longer answer for her own child. He finally understood the profound, unspoken language of that moment in the nursery. When Eleanor heard Noah's inconsolable cries day after day, she wasn't just hearing an employer's distressed baby. She was hearing the echo of her own loss, a call from the infant she never got to bring home. Her body, still aching with the memory of motherhood and still producing milk for a child she could never hold, had responded with an instinct more powerful than any social convention or rule of employment. She had offered his son life, and he, in his arrogant blindness, had accused her of being disturbed. He had humiliated her, fired her, and cast her out. The sheer injustice of his actions was a bitter poison in his own soul. It's so difficult to see the truth when your own pain has turned you into the villain of someone else's story. If you've ever felt that kind of struggle, please consider subscribing. It helps us continue to share these important narratives. A desperate, gut-wrenching remorse washed over him, extinguishing the last embers of his anger. This was no longer about his pride, his rules, or even his grief. It was about his son's life. "Her address," he said to Margaret, his voice hoarse with unshed tears. "Do I need her address?" The slip of paper she gave him led to a modest apartment complex in a working-class neighborhood across the bay, a universe away from the cold, minimalist grandeur of Atherton. The drive felt like an eternity, each red light a moment for his self-recrimination to fester. He rehearsed apologies, but every word felt hollow and insufficient. How could he possibly ask for forgiveness from someone he had so publicly and privately wronged? How could he dare ask her to save the son of the man who had shattered her dignity? Elena's apartment was small but immaculately clean, filled with a quiet sense of peace that his mansion so desperately lacked. On a small end table, a single framed photo of a tiny, sleeping infant stood as a silent, heartbreaking testament to her loss. When she opened the door, her eyes widened in shock, a flicker of fear quickly replaced by a guarded, weary calm. She wasn't angry or vengeful. She just looked tired, as if the world had already taken everything from her. She listened without a single interruption as Ethan stumbled through his apology, his voice cracking with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. He didn't make excuses. He simply laid his failure bare, confessing the blindness of his grief, the cruelty of his actions, and the depth of his regret. "I'm not here to offer you your job back, Elena," he finally said, his gaze meeting hers, his eyes filled with a raw vulnerability that stripped away his CEO persona entirely. "I'm here to beg. My son, Noah, is fading. The doctors say he's malnourished, that he's giving up. He needs you. I know I have no right to ask you for anything, not after what I did, but he doesn't have a mother, and for that one afternoon, you were the only one he ever knew." He stopped, the raw confession hanging in the silent apartment. It was a complete surrender of his power and his pride. In that moment, he wasn't a titan of industry. He was just a father, broken and terrified, pleading for a miracle from the woman he had so carelessly wounded. Elena looked at him, and the silence stretched, heavy with the weight of all that had been said and done. Her own pain was still a fresh, open wound, and the thought of returning to that cold house, the scene of her deepest humiliation, was almost unbearable. But then she thought of Noah. She remembered the feeling of his tiny body finally relaxing in her arms, the serene, contented look on his face as he nursed, the profound, wordless connection that had, for a few precious moments, soothed both of their aching souls. He was just a baby, an innocent caught in the crossfire of adult grief. Her heart ached with a fierce, protective love for him. She couldn't let him suffer for his father's sins. Facing our own mistakes is the first step toward healing. If this story is moving you to reflect, joining our community by subscribing helps us build a space for these moments of truth. Her decision, when it came, was not for Ethan. It was not about forgiveness, at least not yet. It was about love for a child who had no one else. "I will come," she said, her voice soft but imbued with an unshakable firmness. "But I will come for Noah, not for you, for him." The terms were not a negotiation, they were a declaration. She was establishing a boundary he had so carelessly obliterated before. She would not be his employee, a subordinate to be ordered around and dismissed. She would be Noah's caregiver, his advocate, his protector. Ethan nodded, a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees. For the first time in months, a tiny flicker of hope ignited in the suffocating darkness of his world. The car ride back to Atherton was tense and silent, a stark contrast to the frantic energy of his drive out. Sharon stood in the grand entryway, her mouth agape in disbelief as Elena walked past her, no longer a disgraced housekeeper, but a woman carrying a quiet, undeniable authority. Ethan led her directly up the floating staircase to the nursery, where Noah lay whimpering weakly in his crib. The moment Elena lifted the baby into her arms, a visible change came over him. His frail body seemed to recognize her scent, her touch. He nuzzled against her chest, his cries softening to a faint, contented murmur. As she sat in the rocking chair and began to feed him, the room filled once again with a profound, life-affirming peace. Ethan watched from the doorway, a silent, humbled witness to the sacred bond he had so nearly destroyed forever. Months turned into a season, and the sterile Atherton mansion was reborn. The oppressive silence was replaced by the joyful gurgles of a healthy baby, the soft melody of Spanish lullabies, and the quiet, comfortable sounds of a house that had finally become a home. Noah was thriving, his cheeks round and rosy, his eyes bright with curiosity and a deep, unwavering affection for the woman who was his entire world. Elena's presence had been like the first rains after a long drought, coaxing life back into the barren landscape of their lives. Ethan, too, was transformed. He no longer hid in his office, a ghost in his own home. He learned the rhythm of his son's days, the art of a perfect bottle temperature, the magic of a well-timed, silly face. He watched Elena not as an employee, but as a teacher, a guide who was patiently showing him how to mend his own broken heart by loving his son. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in soft shades of purple and orange, Ethan stood in the doorway of the nursery, a silent observer once more. But this time, there was no anger or confusion, only a profound sense of awe. Elena was sitting in the rocking chair, a sleeping Noah nestled against her chest, her hand gently stroking his back. She was humming a soft tune, her face illuminated by the warm glow of a small lamp, and in that moment she was the very picture of maternal love. It was a scene of such perfect, tranquil beauty that it brought a lump to Ethan's throat. He realized with a sudden, heart-stopping clarity that Elena hadn't just saved his son's life. She had given both of them a life worth living. She was not a caregiver filling a role. She was the missing piece of their shattered family, the quiet, steady beat of its new heart. Later, after she had gently placed Noah in his crib, Ethan found her in the living room, gazing out at the garden lights. His own heart pounded with a nervous energy he hadn't felt since his earliest days as an entrepreneur pitching a make-or-break idea. He sat down not beside her, but across from her, giving the space between them a respectful weight. "Elena," he began, his voice softer than he intended, "stripped of all its former authority, I've never properly thanked you, not just for Noah, but for me. You taught me how to be a father. You walked into the wreckage of my life and you didn't run. You stayed, and you built something beautiful. You gave my son a mother's love when he had none, and you gave his father a reason to come home." He paused, gathering the courage for what he had to say next. This was not a business proposition. It was a plea from the very core of his being. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything more. You have already given us everything. But I look at Noah, and I see how he looks at you. You are his mother, in every single way that matters, and I was thinking about his future, about our future." He leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers, filled with a raw, pleading vulnerability. "I want to make it official. I don't want you to be his nanny or his caregiver. I want you to be his mother, legally. I want us to adopt him, together. I want to give him the family he deserves, with the only mother he has ever known." Tears welled in Elena's eyes, silent and immediate, tracing paths down her cheeks. The offer was so much more than she could have ever imagined. It wasn't about a job, or security, or gratitude. It was about belonging. It was about a man who had once cast her out in rage, now inviting her into the very center of his life, offering her the one thing she thought she had lost forever, a child to call her own. She thought of her own lost son, a constant, gentle ache in her heart. This wouldn't replace him, nothing ever could, but it felt like a way to honor his memory, to pour all the love she still carried for him into this beautiful boy who needed her so desperately. She looked at Ethan, the broken man now made whole, and nodded slowly. A single, profound gesture of acceptance. In the quiet of the vast, lonely mansion, a family was finally, truly born. The adoption was finalized, not in a cold, impersonal courtroom, but in the sunlit living room of the mansion, the same room that had once felt like a museum. The judge, an old family friend, smiled warmly as Ethan and Elena signed the papers that officially made Noah their son. With the stroke of a pen, a family born from tragedy was legally bound by love. The last vestige of the old, cold regime was quietly dismissed the next day. Sharon was let go, not with anger, but with a simple, firm statement from Ethan that the home now had all the care it needed. The sterile silence of the past was permanently banished, replaced by the joyful chaos of a child's laughter, the scattering of colorful toys across marble floors, and the soft, constant hum of Spanish lullabies that had become the mansion's true heartbeat. In the year that followed, Ethan's transformation became a quiet force for good beyond the walls of his home. He established the Margaret Pierce Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to a cause born from his own painful journey. The foundation provided critical support for mothers who had lost their infants and funded specialized care for orphaned newborns suffering from failure to thrive. He poured the same relentless drive that had built his tech empire into this new venture, but his motivation was no longer profit, it was purpose. He traded boardrooms for hospital wings and shareholder meetings for quiet conversations with grieving parents. He discovered that true wealth wasn't measured in stock prices, but in the profound, humbling act of turning his deepest pain into someone else's hope, honoring the wife he lost by saving the children she never got to meet. 5 years later, the once lifeless garden was a vibrant playground. A small boy with Ethan's determined eyes and Elena's warm smile chased a soccer ball across the lush grass, his laughter echoing in the warm California air. "Mama, look!" Noah shouted, kicking the ball with all his might toward Elena, who caught him in a loving embrace. Ethan watched them from the patio. No longer a haunted figure, but a man completely at peace, his face softened by years of joy. The ghosts of the past had long since faded, replaced by the beautiful, tangible reality of his family. He was no longer just a CEO or a widower. He was a father and a husband, roles he now cherished above all others. The sterile mansion had finally, irrevocably, become a home filled with light and unconditional love. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the garden, Ethan joined Elena on the grass, wrapping his arms around her and Noah in a single, unified hug. They watched their son, a living, breathing testament to the miracle that had unfolded within their lives. Their journey was a powerful reminder that from the deepest chasms of grief, the most resilient love can grow, and that a family is not defined by blood, but by the hands that choose to hold on. It's a truth that gives hope to so many, and being able to share these stories of healing is a gift we can only continue to offer, with your support when you subscribe.